The Mediterranean that night was not a sea. It was a living thing, furious and alive, a black expanse rising and crashing under a sky ripped by lightning. Waves as tall as houses slammed against steel hulls. Men clung to railings slick with salt and rain, their helmets glinting whenever lightning flashed. Somewhere in that chaos, among the thousands of ships stretching from horizon to horizon, was an army preparing to invade Europe. It was July 9th, 1943. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, was hours away. On paper, the plan was simple. Nearly 160,000 American and British troops would land on the southern beaches of Sicily, establishing a foothold for the next stage of the war. In reality, it was madness. The storm that swept across the Mediterranean that night was unlike anything the invasion planners had expected. Winds screamed at 70 miles per hour, and waves pounded the fleet so violently that landing craft broke loose from their ships and disappeared into the darkness. Inside one of the transports, Private First Class Thomas Keegan of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division pressed his face to a porthole, trying to see anything beyond the blur of water and lightning. He could taste fear and diesel in the air. "If this is the calm before the storm," someone muttered, "God help us when the real one hits." On the bridge of the USS Samuel Chase, an officer shouted over the wind, "Sir, should we delay?" The reply came cold and sharp. "Eisenhower says go, we go." Far across the sea, in bunkers along the Sicilian coast, German and Italian officers watched the weather rage and shook their heads. No one, not even the insane Americans, would try to land in this. Major General Paul Conrath of the Hermann Göring Division turned to his staff and said, "No invasion tonight. They'd drown before they reached us." Many troops were ordered to stand down, some even taking shelter in nearby towns. But the Americans were coming. At 2200 hours, the first wave of paratroopers took off into the storm. C-47 transport planes shuddered under the wind, tossed like leaves in a hurricane. Inside, paratroopers gripped their static lines, faces pale under red lights. Lieutenant Jack Norton of the 82nd Airborne remembered thinking, "If the Germans don't kill us, the weather will." When the green light finally blinked, men jumped, straight into chaos. Wind blew them miles off course. Some landed in the sea and drowned before they could cut free of their chutes. Others found themselves scattered across olive groves, vineyards, and rocky hills, alone, lost, soaked to the bone. Yet somehow, through confusion and courage, they began to fight, ambushing patrols, blowing bridges, and spreading panic among Axis defenders who still didn't understand how anyone could have arrived in such weather. Back at sea, the invasion fleet fought its own battle, not against the enemy, but against nature itself. The landing craft were lowered into the heaving waters, slamming into the waves like toys. Engines sputtered, men vomited, weapons and radios were drenched in seawater. Still, the officers barked orders, "Move, move, move." Keegan climbed down the rope ladder into a landing craft that dropped 10 feet before smashing into the water. The helmsman shouted, "Hold on," as the craft swung toward the beach through walls of foam. For hours, they battled the sea. Many never reached land. Some were swallowed whole, others drifted off course, landing miles from their objectives. And yet, through that chaos, through lightning and wind and waves, the invasion continued. At 2:45 hours, the first flashes of tracer fire cut through the rain. Machine guns opened up from the beaches. The landing craft were close enough now for the men to hear the bullets slap into the water. "Hit the sand and keep moving," shouted the sergeant. Keegan jumped, stumbling into knee-deep surf. The cold bit through his uniform as he waded forward, waves smashing into his chest. Behind him, another craft overturned, screams lost in the roar of the storm. When he finally crawled onto the sand, the world was a blur of lightning and fire. Shells from American destroyers thundered overhead, pounding Axis positions beyond the dunes. Every explosion illuminated a nightmare: bodies, wrecked boats, burning vehicles. The smell of oil and cordite mixed with the salt air. Somewhere in the confusion, a young lieutenant waved his pistol and yelled, "Get off the beach! Find cover!" By dawn, the wind began to ease, but the destruction was clear. At least 24 landing craft had capsized. Entire platoons were missing. Equipment lay scattered along the shoreline like driftwood. And yet, miraculously, the beachhead at Gala was forming. Soldiers regrouped, set up machine guns, and dug in among the dunes. Out at sea, General George S. Patton watched through binoculars from the deck of the Monrovia, his jaw set like stone. "They're on the beach," someone said. "In this weather?" another officer whispered. Patton didn't answer. He simply said, "Then they'll stay there." On the other side of the island, German reconnaissance pilots reported something that stunned their commanders. Hundreds of ships off Sicily's south coast, unloading men and armor in the middle of a receding storm. "Impossible," one colonel said. "No army could land in that." But the Americans had. As the rain faded and the sky lightened to gray, men of the U.S. 1st and 45th Division stood amid wreckage, exhausted, soaked, and shaking. They had fought the sea and survived. Ahead of them lay a new enemy, the German army. Yet for now, the impossible had already been done. They had landed through a hurricane and lived to tell about it. Somewhere near the water's edge, Keegan sat down beside a wrecked LCVP and looked back at the waves that had nearly killed him. The storm clouds were breaking apart, sunlight pushing through. He whispered to himself, barely audible over the surf, "If we can make it through that, maybe we can make it through anything." The sea at last was calm, but the island ahead was waiting, and it would not be merciful.
At dawn on July 10th, 1943, the storm began to die, but the battle was only beginning. The first gray light revealed a coastline still hidden behind curtains of mist and smoke. Gela, Licata, Skuljitti, names that would soon be burned into memory, lay before the Americans like ghosts behind veils of surf. The sea was calmer now, but wreckage drifted everywhere. Broken landing craft, smashed crates, floating helmets. The Mediterranean had swallowed part of the army, but the rest had made it ashore, wet, cold, and furious. Lieutenant General George S. Patton stood on the bridge of the USS Monrovia, binoculars raised, his coat soaked through. Around him, the invasion fleet stretched to the horizon. Landing ships disgorged tanks and jeeps into the surf. Cranes swung supplies overboard into waiting boats. The storm had delayed everything, yet somehow men were still landing. It was a sight even Patton could barely believe. "By God," he said softly, "they did it." On the beaches near Gela, the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, was clawing its way inland. The surf still crashed around them, and every step forward was a fight. Equipment was lost, radios ruined, ammunition soaked through. Platoons stumbled through dunes under fire from scattered Italian defenders. Mortar shells fell short, hissing into the sand. The chaos was complete, but the Americans refused to stop. Private Thomas Keegan's unit had found cover behind a low embankment, their uniforms heavy with seawater. The sergeant shouted over the din, "Weapons dry! Get those machine guns set!" They stripped the bolts, cleaned the barrels, shaking water from their hands. Keegan looked back and saw the sea behind them, littered with burning debris. A landing craft nearby exploded when a shell hit its fuel tanks, a fireball roaring into the sky. The concussion threw men into the sand. He coughed through the smoke, ears ringing, heart hammering. Somewhere to the east, at Skuljitti, the 45th Infantry Division fought to regroup after a nightmare landing. Many of their boats had been scattered miles off course during the storm. Units were mixed together, Oklahoma farm boys fighting beside New Yorkers, each shouting to find their companies. Yet within hours, small bands of soldiers were linking up, pushing into the hills, clearing out Italian gun nests one by one. The resistance was scattered, but stubborn. Overhead, the sky cleared enough for American and British planes to appear, low and fast, strafing German positions inland. The sound of engines brought a strange comfort to the men below. It meant they weren't alone. But soon after, confusion struck again. A flight of C-47s carrying reinforcements arrived too early, their path crossing naval artillery fire. In the panic, Allied ships opened fire by mistake, shooting down several of their own planes. Flaming wreckage rained into the sea. The horror of friendly fire silenced the beaches for minutes, until the guns started again. At mid-morning, reports reached Axis Command. General Hans Valentin Hubei of the 14th Panzer Corps was incredulous. In this weather? Impossible. No one could survive that. His staff officers showed him reconnaissance photos, blurred images of ships and smoke along the coast. Hubei turned to his aide and muttered, "Then they are madmen." Orders went out for an immediate counterattack. The elite Hermann Göring Division, stationed near Caltagirone, began to move. Back on the beach at Gela, the Americans were finally beginning to organize. Engineers cleared mines under sniper fire. Navy beachmasters waded through surf up to their waists, directing landing craft with signal flags and curses. "You're in the wrong damn sector," one screamed, as a craft grounded 30 yards from where it should have landed. Yet by some miracle of grit and improvisation, the landing zone started to take shape. By noon, tanks were rolling off LSTs, massive gray ships that opened their jaws to the sea. M4 Shermans rumbled through the surf, engines roaring, treads biting into wet sand. Some sank almost immediately, disappearing into the shallows. Others made it ashore, dripping seawater and salt, their crews waving to the infantry who cheered like men seeing land after weeks at sea. The storm had tried to break them, but now they had steel on the beach. Patton finally came ashore around midday, striding through the surf with his ivory-handled pistols gleaming in the sun. His officers tried to dissuade him, but he refused. "A general belongs where the shells fall," he snapped. When he reached the sand, he looked around at the wreckage, overturned boats, bodies, scattered crates, and smiled grimly. "This," he said, "is what winning looks like." Inland, small groups of paratroopers, men who had been blown miles off target the night before, were beginning to appear. They staggered out of olive groves and vineyards, covered in mud, their uniforms torn. Some had fought skirmishes with German patrols. Others had rescued civilians from collapsing houses. Now they joined the beach forces, forming impromptu units. The Americans, by sheer will, were stitching order out of chaos. Meanwhile, at Licata, British and American forces were linking up, trading cigarettes and tea under the smell of cordite and diesel. "Bloody hell, you Yanks really did come through that storm," one British sergeant asked. A grinning American replied, "We surfed in." The laughter was short-lived. Artillery began to fall again from inland. The men scattered, cursing, diving for cover as the earth shook around them. By late afternoon, the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The sea turned silver, calm, and deceptive. The storm was gone, but its mark remained. The coastline was a graveyard of wreckage. Yet amid that ruin, now American flags flew from dunes and jeeps. The beachheads were secure. That night, as the men dug foxholes and waited for the next day's fight, word spread. The landings had succeeded. Against the storm, against the odds, they had done what even the Germans believed was impossible. Private Keegan sat by a wrecked jeep, scribbling a few lines in a damp notebook. The sea tried to kill us. The wind tried to turn us back. but we came anyway. I don't think they understand. We're not here because it's easy. We're here because it's necessary." Far inland, German officers stared at their maps in disbelief. The weather had been their ally, and still the Americans had landed. Tomorrow, they decided, would be different. They would counterattack. They would throw them back into the sea. But on the beaches of Sicily, under a quiet, starlit sky, the Americans were already digging in, rifles cleaned, machine guns mounted, waiting for whatever came next. The storm was over. The real battle was about to begin.
Dawn rose red over Gela on July 11th, a blood-colored sun climbing through the haze of smoke and dust. The storm was gone now, but its fury had been replaced by something worse. Somewhere beyond the inland ridges, engines were rumbling, deep, mechanical, and steady. The sound carried through the morning air like thunder. To the men of the 1st Infantry Division, it was the sound of tanks. Private Thomas Keegan was crouched in a foxhole dug into the sand, the smell of salt and cordite still thick around him. He'd barely slept an hour. All night long, the engineers had worked by flashlight to drag wrecked vehicles off the beach, set up defensive lines, and move ammunition inland. The beachhead was secure, but barely, and now, as the low growl of engines grew louder, everyone knew the Germans were coming. At 0700 hours, the first artillery shells began to fall. The horizon flashed, and then the air ripped open with sound. Shells whistled overhead and slammed into the dunes, sending fountains of sand and debris into the air. Men shouted and dove for cover. Radios crackled with urgent messages. Enemy armor sighted east of Gela. General George S. Patton stood near a half-buried jeep, his field glasses trained inland. "Here they come," he said, almost with admiration. Through the rising heat, the silhouettes of German Panzer IVs appeared, cresting the ridges in perfect formation, dark, angular beasts moving with deadly precision. Behind them came trucks of infantry from the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, veterans of the Eastern Front, their discipline unbroken even after the storm. The German counterattack began like a hammer blow. Tanks advanced in pairs, firing high-explosive shells into the American lines. Mortar teams followed close behind. In minutes, the beaches that had been scenes of chaos and triumph the day before became killing grounds again. Keegan's squad held their position behind a line of sand dunes. "Hold your fire," the sergeant yelled. "Wait till you see the whites of their eyes or their crosses." The laughter died as a Panzer shell exploded nearby, tossing one of their machine guns into the air. Keegan ducked, feeling the shockwave in his bones. Inland, the Germans pressed hard, reaching within a mile of the beaches. American Sherman tanks tried to move up to meet them, but the terrain was soft, sand and loose earth that bogged down their treads. Several became easy targets. Flames erupted from a hit Sherman, the crew bailing out, some on fire. Then from the sea came a new sound, the deep, rolling boom of naval guns. The USS Boise had spotted the German advance. At Patton's request, its guns swung toward the shore. Moments later, a salvo of 6-inch shells screamed inland and detonated among the advancing panzers. The earth shook. Black smoke rose where German tanks had been seconds before. Another salvo followed, then another. The ground seemed to quake with each blast. "Good shooting, Boise," Patton shouted into his radio. "Keep it coming." From his foxhole, Keegan looked up as the sky filled with streaks of fire. The thunder of naval guns mixed with the rattling of small arms and the clatter of machine guns. It was chaos, but organized chaos now, American chaos. Men were fighting with purpose. Near the town of Gela itself, paratroopers who had been scattered by the storm days earlier were now joining the fight. Some had no radio contact, no clear orders, but they followed the sound of the guns. They appeared on the flanks of the German columns, firing bazookas and rifles from vineyards and stone walls. One lieutenant, armed with only a carbine and a handful of grenades, took out a half-track by himself, diving for cover as it exploded.
For every yard the Germans gained, the Americans countered with sheer tenacity. Machine gunners and foxholes mowed down infantry. Anti-tank teams dragged 37-millimeter guns through sand, firing point-blank at the advancing panzers. Every man on the line fought as if the beach behind him were the edge of the world. At midday, the Germans reached their high water mark. Several tanks broke through to the outskirts of Jella. The situation hung by a thread. Then, the naval fire intensified. The USS Savannah joined the bombardment, its guns firing almost continuously. Shells landed so close to American positions that the concussion stunned friendly troops, but it broke the German attack. A Panzer command vehicle was hit directly, its turret blown clear off. The German advance faltered. Officers shouted orders trying to regroup, but the naval fire was relentless. Within an hour, the fields east of Jella were a wasteland of burning armor. By afternoon, the counterattack had collapsed. Smoke drifted across the battlefield, the sun glinting off twisted metal and blackened wreckage. The Hermann Göring division, battered and stunned, began to withdraw toward the interior. Patton, his uniform dusted with sand, watched through his binoculars. "That's the end of their push," he said quietly. "They threw their best at us and were still standing." He turned to his staff and added, "Tell the Navy they saved our boys today." On the beach, the medics moved among the wounded. Keegan sat beside a destroyed half-track, his ears still ringing. His hands trembled as he lit a cigarette, staring at the horizon where the German tanks had vanished. "They came at us like a storm," he said to no one in particular, "but we've lived through worse storms than them." That night, as the sky turned orange from distant fires, the men of the 1st Infantry Division realized what they had done. They hadn't just survived the sea, they had faced Germany's finest armored division and held their ground. Reports later showed that the naval bombardment alone had destroyed more than 40 German vehicles, saving the entire landing force from annihilation. One German officer, captured days later, was asked what he thought of the Americans. He replied simply, "They don't know when to die." By midnight, the beaches were quiet again, only the sound of waves against the shore. Men slept in their foxholes, rifles beside them, and the sand still warm from the fires of the day. Above them, the stars returned, clear and calm. The storm of nature had tested them. The storm of steel had tried to crush them. Both had failed. Tomorrow they would move inland. The island and the war were waiting. The battle for the beaches was over, but the fight for Sicily, for every sun-scorched hill, every winding road, every town clinging to its stones, had just begun. By the morning of July 12th, the island was a furnace. The same wind that had nearly destroyed the invasion fleet now blew dry and hot from the African desert, whipping dust through the olive groves and into men's eyes. The air smelled of diesel, citrus, and cordite. Convoys stretched for miles, jeeps, half-tracks, Shermans, British Churchills, crawling north through roads barely wide enough for 2 mules to pass. General George S. Patton didn't wait for orders. He was supposed to protect the left flank while Montgomery's 8th Army pushed along the eastern coast toward Messina. But patience was not in Patton's nature. "We're not here to guard," he growled to his staff. "We're here to win." So began the race across Sicily. At first, the resistance was light. The Italian troops, weary and disillusioned, surrendered in droves. Some villagers even greeted the Americans with bread, wine, and cautious smiles. Children waved small white flags from balconies. Old women pressed fruit into the soldiers' hands. For a brief moment, it felt less like invasion and more like deliverance. But the Germans, veterans of North Africa, tough and disciplined, were not retreating without a fight. They turned every ridge into a fortress, every road into a killing zone. Near Kaneckity, the Hermann Göring division struck again, ambushing an American column with artillery hidden in vineyards. The first shells hit a fuel truck. The explosion lifted it into the air like a comet. Trucks burned, ammunition cooked off, the heat so intense that rifles warped. Yet within minutes, the GIs regrouped, flanking the German guns through the dry riverbeds, bayonets fixed, grenades primed.
When it was over, the vineyard was a wasteland of smoke and shattered glass. Further west, Patton pushed toward Palermo, driving his men at a punishing pace. "Keep moving," he barked, "or I'll find someone who will." He slept barely 2 hours a night, writing orders by lantern light, his boots coated in dust. Reporters following his army called it a storm on wheels. In 17 days, the Americans captured more than 100 towns. Private Thomas Keegan, now hardened by 2 weeks of combat, rode in the back of a jeep, watching the landscape blur past. Hills stripped bare by sun, villages half destroyed, goats wandering among ruins. He thought of the sea at Gela, of the friends he'd buried there. Every mile inland felt like borrowed time. On July 22nd, Patton's tanks rolled into Palermo. The Sicilian capital, once the jewel of Mussolini's empire, was silent except for the rumble of engines. Italian officers stood on the steps of the royal palace, white flags in hand. Patton entered the city in his command car, saluted by crowds that seemed unsure whether to cheer or stare. He stepped out, removed his helmet, and looked up at the shattered buildings. "You have been liberated," he told the mayor, "by people who know what liberty means." News of Palermo's fall stunned the German high command. Field Marshal Kesselring, overseeing Axis forces in Italy, radioed Berlin. "The Americans move faster than expected. Their armor is relentless." Hitler's reply was cold. "Then delay them, make them bleed." And so the Germans withdrew eastward toward Messina, destroying bridges and mining every road behind them. The mountains became their allies, steep, narrow passes where a single panzer could hold off an entire column. The heat was merciless. Soldiers drank from canteens gone warm, rationing water as they climbed. The dust stuck to their skin, turned their faces gray. In late July, Patton's men reached the Trewina Line, the Germans' last major defense in central Sicily. For 6 days, the battle raged among rocky slopes and ravines. The enemy's artillery was devastating. Every attack uphill cost lives. Keegan's platoon fought from one stone terrace to another, the sound of machine guns echoing off the cliffs. One night, as tracer rounds zipped across the valley like fireflies, he whispered to his sergeant, "Feels like the storm again." The sergeant nodded, eyes fixed on the flashes in the dark. "Yeah, except this one doesn't blow over." Still, inch by inch, the Americans pushed forward. When Trewina finally fell on August 6th, the defenders slipped away under cover of darkness. The next morning, the Stars and Stripes flew over the town's ruined church. The bells, cracked by shellfire, rang a broken victory. Patton pressed on, determined to reach Messina before Montgomery. The two generals, allies in name, rivals in spirit, were locked in a silent competition. Monty's British troops advanced up the eastern coast, meeting fierce resistance from German rear guards. Patton's columns took the northern route, hugging the shoreline, blasting through tunnels and cliffs. "Tell Montgomery," Patton said with a grin, "we'll meet him for breakfast in Messina." Each day, the Germans fought delaying actions and slipped away just before being encircled. Each night, American engineers built bridges under fire to keep the advance going. Supply lines stretched thin, but morale soared. The men knew they were part of something larger, the first great Allied victory on European soil. By the end of July, Sicily was collapsing around the Axis. Mussolini had been arrested in Rome. The fascist regime was falling apart. Italian soldiers threw down their weapons, their officers vanishing into the hills. Yet the Germans fought on, disciplined to the last. On August 1st, under a blazing noon sun, Patton paused near the coastal town of San Stefano. Before him lay the final stretch, a narrow road winding through cliffs toward Messina. He climbed onto the hood of his jeep, surveyed the horizon, and said, "We've crossed this damned island in 23 days. The next time we land, it'll be on the mainland." Behind him, the men cheered, though their voices were hoarse and tired. They knew what it meant. Sicily was nearly theirs. That night, Keegan sat on a rock overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. The water shimmered in the moonlight, calm, peaceful, deceptive. He remembered the storm that had brought them here, the friends lost to waves and fire. The sea had tried to stop them, the Germans had tried to break them, but still they moved forward. Somewhere across that water lay Italy, and beyond it, Germany itself. The war was far from over. The race for Messina was entering its final stretch. And the Americans, against all odds, were winning.
The island that had swallowed an army in storm and flame now lay still beneath a golden Sicilian sun. August had come, and with it, the end of everything that began that terrible night at sea. What started in chaos and wind had become a relentless march through dust, fire, and victory. The last act was about to begin. By mid-August, the Germans were retreating toward Messina, the northeastern tip of Sicily, just a few miles of water separating them from mainland Italy. Every bridge they crossed, they blew behind them. Every road they left, they mined. They were disciplined even in defeat. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had ordered a withdrawal so precise it seemed like a machine running backward. Each night, columns of trucks and tanks crept along the coastal roads under cover of darkness, slipping across the Strait of Messina on ferries before dawn. Patton knew it. He could see it. From the high cliffs above the coast, he could watch their searchlights sweeping the narrow waters, the faint rumble of engines carrying over the waves. He clenched his fists in frustration. He hadn't come all this way to let them escape. But the terrain and the Germans made pursuit nearly impossible. The enemy fought delaying actions in every village, every pass. Mines and booby traps littered the roads. Even a single panzer could hold up an entire battalion for hours. The island itself seemed to conspire with them, its ridges rising like walls, its roads twisting like serpents. Still, Patton refused to stop. "He can't run forever," he told his staff. "We'll chase him until they have nowhere left to go." On August 10th, his troops took San Fratello after a brutal night attack in driving rain, the first storm since the invasion. Some men said it felt like the sea had followed them inland. Others just dug in and kept moving. Private Thomas Keegan was among them. His uniform was torn, his face gaunt from weeks of heat and dust. He carried his rifle slung across his chest, the wooden stock worn smooth with sweat. "You think we'll catch him, Sarge?" he asked one evening, as they watched the sun set behind the hills. The sergeant spat into the dirt. "Doesn't matter if we do. They know we could have. That's enough." By now, even the German officers admitted what they faced. A captured colonel of the Hermann Göring division told his interrogators, "Your soldiers fight like machines. They come through storms, through fire, through anything. They do not break." The Americans pushed north one last time, driving along the coastal highway toward Messina. The British, under Montgomery, were closing in from the south. Both armies knew the race was nearly over. On the morning of August 16th, Patton's lead elements, the 3rd Infantry Division, fought their way into the outskirts of Messina. Snipers fired from the rooftops, but resistance was collapsing. The last German ferries were already crossing the strait. By afternoon, the city was half empty, echoing with the sound of distant explosions as the enemy destroyed their docks behind them. At 10:30 hours on August 17, 1943, an American armored car rolled into the central square of Messina. A few civilians peeked from shuttered windows as the Stars and Stripes was raised over the city hall. Minutes later, Patton himself entered the city in his command car, stepping out beneath the smoking ruins. He removed his helmet, looked around at the shattered buildings, and smiled, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. "We've done it. We've taken the first step into Europe." When Montgomery arrived a few hours later, Patton was already there to greet him. The two generals shook hands stiffly, posing for the cameras, each knowing they had written their own chapter of history. For the men who had fought their way here, from the storm to the sand to the burning hills, there was only relief. The island was theirs. The price had been heavy, but the victory was complete. That night, the soldiers camped on the cliffs overlooking the Strait of Messina. The air was finally still. The sea, the same sea that had nearly destroyed them 5 weeks earlier, shimmered in the moonlight, calm as glass. Across the water, they could see the faint lights of Calabria, the Italian mainland, the next battleground. Keegan sat alone at the edge of the cliff, his boots dangling over the rocks. He could smell the salt again, feel the wind off the water. It carried memories, the roar of the storm, the crash of the waves, the screams, the fire. but now it was quiet, peaceful, almost forgiving. He opened his battered notebook and wrote the final line beneath pages stained by rain, mud, and blood. We came through the storm, not because we were fearless, but because we were too stubborn to stop. As dawn broke over Sicily for the last time under fire, the men of the 1st and 45th Divisions began to rest. They had landed in a hurricane, fought tanks and heat, crossed an island of stone, and still won. Word spread across the Allied lines that Mussolini had fallen, the fascist regime crumbling in Rome. The invasion of Sicily had done what no one thought possible. It had cracked open the Axis from within. In Berlin, the news hit like thunder. German officers studied the reports in silence. One of them, the same who had dismissed the Americans as amateurs weeks earlier, spoke only 5 words. They landed in a storm and still won. And with that, the world turned. Because on the beaches of Sicily, amid wreckage and wind and fire, the Americans had proven something no storm could wash away. That courage, once awakened, can outlast even the fury of the sea. The storm had cleared. Europe was waiting.